This is our unlucky guy of the day, a support four-eyed who used to get beaten up by monsters. But even so, he was part of one of the most important hero parties. How that happened, I have no idea. The real trouble in this story begins when his own friends show up one day and tell him he's expelled. From that point on, God decided to bless his life. He awakened an ultra-rare power to control the wind, and now every girl that crosses his path wants to join his group. Yeah, my friend. Choose your pill, live in a world where you're treated like trash but still make good money, or have your luck flipped upside down, get the strongest power, and lead a guild full of beautiful girls. I don't know about you, but to me, only one of those answers is correct. Now, with everything that's happening, our once weakest protagonist is about to show his true, absurdly overpowered rage. So if you're here for the girls, just like me, let's get started. One day, countless plants and animals on the planet turned into monsters. Soon after, invaders started appearing from other dimensions. The world we knew was thrown into complete chaos. Amid the ruins, a man screamed for help as he was surrounded by a roaring monster. At that moment, the beast was sliced apart because to fight these creatures, humanity had created a guild of heroes who had awakened special powers. The monster rose again, roaring from the ground, charging forward with its massive axe. When it struck, one of the guys shouted that this thing was way too strong. Meanwhile, our poor little protagonist was nearly crushed, yelling desperately for help. The mage behind him screamed and unleashed her special lightning ability. Bolts of electricity rained down, electrocuting the monster. But seconds after she smiled and said it was over, the creature stood up again, roaring even louder. It charged straight toward the girl. But our Chad, even though he was weak, jumped in and pushed her out of the way. He looked back, thinking they had bought enough time. At that moment, Mia, one of the strongest in the group, rushed in. She unleashed a swift slash that brought the monster to its knees. The furious boss tried to fight back, but she smirked and told it to look up, because from above came a man using his meteor break attack, finishing the monster in a single blow. These insanely powerful people were members of the Kiros Guild, the #1 guild in the world, and the guild leader, Hante, said their mission was complete. Our protagonist, even though weak, was actually one of the founders of that guild, or rather was, because Hante suddenly turned to him and said, "Buddy, you're expelled from the guild." From that day on, he wandered the streets thinking about how he had spent 7 years helping the guild grow, only to be kicked out and given a mere 10 million as payment. He overheard everyone saying he was useless, which shattered what little self-esteem he had left. In the middle of the rain, he questioned why he ever stayed in that guild. He couldn't let things end like this. As lightning struck around him, he activated his ability. He wouldn't allow his story to finish this way. He knew his unique power only activated randomly in special situations. After being expelled, he spent a week searching for a new guild until he finally came across one called the Fun Guild. A system window appeared before him displaying unexpected information. According to the data, the chances of the Fun Guild growing and becoming a major organization if Yu Jia-han were to join it were 99%. Thanks to his ability, he realized that this guild had far more potential than the Kiros Guild. Upon arriving at the Fun Guild headquarters, Kim Sai-hoo was frustrated to notice a power outage, causing a small accident as she spilled her raiment. At that moment, Yu Jia-han walked through the door, breathing heavily. Seeing him, Kim Sai-hoo turned around, surprised, trying to understand who this stranger was. Out of breath, he announced his intention to join the guild. Before he could say anything else, he felt his body give out. His eyes closed and he collapsed to the floor, losing consciousness. Startled by his sudden fall, she approached and asked if he was okay. Sometime later, the protagonist woke up on the couch. Sitting beside him, she watched him closely and asked if he had finally woken up. Kim Sai-hoo, the leader of the Fun Guild, showed concern as she called him by name and informed him he had been unconscious for about an hour. Still feeling the impact, he raised his hand to his head and asked how she knew his name. In response, she showed him some documents containing his information, leaving him surprised. Curious, she asked why someone from the renowned Kiros Guild would want to join such a small guild after having been part of such a grand one. Faced with the question, his expression changed and he lowered his head. Standing up from the couch, he said he could explain everything to her. After hearing him out, Kim Sai-hoo clapped her hands lightly and said she now understood his situation. Leaning on her hands, she commented that with his experience, he could easily join another guild. However, she couldn't understand why he had chosen the Fun Guild in particular. He tried to answer but hesitated, wondering if she would believe him if she knew the truth about his mysterious ability. Noticing his difficulty in talking about it, Kim Sai-hoo decided to share something about herself first. Taking off her headphones, she revealed that she was the daughter of an elf and a human, and thus a half-elf. Surprised by the information, he repeated the question to confirm if she really was a half-elf. He reflected for a moment on the countless invasions from different dimensions and how they led to the emergence of various species in the world, including elves. Kim Sai-hoo continued, mentioning that the blood of elves, who had once exterminated humans, ran in her veins. Faced with the revelation, he formed his own opinion on the matter. She then looked directly at him and asked if, even knowing that he still wished to join the Fun Guild. The two exchanged an intense look. It was at that moment that he noticed something peculiar. Even though she was trying to intimidate him, Her hands were visibly trembling. Surprised by his reaction, she watched him closely. Without showing any fear, he stated that he had nothing against elves, as he had seen them before and didn't consider them very different from humans. With a calm smile, he added that only idiots would discriminate against someone based on their species. Kim Sai-hoo covered her mouth with her hand, embarrassed by her attempt to provoke him. After a brief moment of reflection, she said she understood his stance and that she would consider his application to the guild, promising to contact him later. He agreed to that and thanked her. While everything seemed to have been resolved, something unexpected happened. Kim Sai-hoo looked at her staff, noticing with surprise that a strong glow was emanating from it. Suddenly, a bright light emerged from the artifact, transforming into a concentrated sphere of energy. Recognizing the phenomenon, Kim Sai-hoo realized that it was the spirit of Sylph, who had been dormant for 12 years. Watching the sphere of energy approach the protagonist, she questioned herself, intrigued about the reason behind such an event. He in turn was surprised by the spirit's reaction and tried to understand what it meant. Before he could process the situation, a pillar of radiant light surrounded him. Sitting on the floor, Kim Sai-hoo watched the scene in shock, murmuring to herself that this couldn't be happening. The protagonist looked at his own hand, noticing it was now covered in wind energy. Still in disbelief, Kim Sai-hoo came to the conclusion that Sylph had just formed a contract with him. He, on the other hand, realized something even more impressive. The one who had been rejected and expelled from his former guild now possessed a super rare class. After all, in that moment, he had become an elementalist, class that only 20 people in the entire world possessed. Furthermore, some people formed contracts with special creatures, acquiring unique powers and receiving the coveted super rare class of elementalist. In this world, there were only a few elementalists, among them Luca Harrison, the Mist Elementalist, Morosi, the Sea Elementalist, and Abubakar, the Sand Elementalist. They were extraordinary individuals, each possessing power comparable to that of an entire guild. Now, however, another rare elementalist had appeared. The protagonist had become a wind elementalist. After some time, the hero guild, Yu Jai-han, asked if he had made a contract with the spirit. Kim Sai-hoo confirmed, explaining that she had sealed a pact with touched at the right moment, he would have an 82% chance to evade the attack. Without hesitation, he activated his accelerate skill, which allowed him to launch a devastating strike against the monsters, eliminating them before they could react. Meanwhile, his companion watched him, visibly impressed. A surprise on her face was evident, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She wondered how he had managed to master communication with sylphs so quickly, and whether he had really awakened his powers just one day ago. While thinking about it, she began to question what kind of person he really was. Unbothered by her doubts, he sheathed his weapon and picked up the body of the defeated monster. He figured it was a good time to start collecting resources. Seeing this, she ran to him and agreed with his decision. He figured that this training was already enough to test his skills, but suddenly, a bad feeling made him shiver. Danger was approaching. In a quick reflex, he shouted her name, warning that something was behind her. She turned, confused, not understanding what was happening. But then a massive basilisk emerged from the shadows. For a brief moment, she froze in fear and asked hesitantly how the creature had appeared in a 5th-class monster territory. He remained focused and took a defensive stance, reflecting on the situation. He concluded that the creature must belong to an unknown class, much more dangerous than the previous ones. Activating his analysis skill, he watched a new system window appear. The data was clear. The probability of defeating that monster was only 12%. He knew he needed a strategy. He turned to his companion and asked if she could slow the basilisk down. She hesitated, surprised by the request. She looked uncomfortable and apologized, explaining that she could only immobilize the monster for a short time. For him, that would be enough. Without wasting any more time, he charged for the creature. Sensing the threat, the basilisk let out a deafening roar and launched a fierce attack, extending its claws. He knew he had to act at that very moment and shouted for his companion to activate her skill. Quickly, she cast Slow Wind, and the creature was temporarily frozen in place. Taking the opportunity, he leaped up, raising his weapon to deliver a decisive blow. However, the creature grew even more enraged and with immense strength, broke through the magical restraint, freeing itself completely. In one swift, brutal move, it hurled him straight toward its open mouth. As he was thrown, memories from the past flooded his mind. He remembered the former guild leader, who once called him useless, but he was no longer that weak young man. In the next instant, Kim Sai-hoo, witnessing everything, used her ability and immobilized the basilisk. Taking the chance, the protagonist gathered all his energy and activated the powerful Wind Slash skill. His blow was devastating, ripping through the creature and ending the battle. In the distance, Doha, the Earth Elementalist, was watching the scene closely. He let out a surprised sigh before murmuring to himself that, after all, there was another elementalist in Korea besides him. After some time in Gyeonggi province, within the 2nd-class monster territory, giant worms emerged from the ruins of the city. Wang Juno, upon spotting them, activated his aggression skill, preparing for the imminent attack. As one of the creatures lunged at him, trying to break through his defense, he realized he wouldn't be able to hold it off for long. He shouted his companion's name, urging her to act quickly. Lim Sayam, without hesitation, activated Chain Lightning. The monsters were struck by a sequence of lightning bolts, receiving fatal damage. Seeing the enemies fall, she gave a smug smile, unable to understand how such small creatures could make so much noise. Huan Juno, irritated by the imprecision of the attack, sharply called her attention, warning that he had nearly been hit. She, indifferent, made a provocative remark that he should lose weight to move better. Before they could continue the argument, Huan Juno noticed movement behind her. His eyes locked onto another living creature. Lim Sion, noticing his expression, turned quickly and called out to Yu Jia-han, asking for cover. But upon facing the monster in front of her, she was startled to realize that man was no longer part of her team. In an instant, Kim Hyuntae appeared, wielding his weapon and slicing the monster in half without any difficulty. Lim Sion turned to the master of the Kara Guild, surprised by his sudden appearance. Time passed, and Lim Sion, exhausted, tried to catch her breath. The battle had been tougher than expected. Huan Juno, equally tired, commented that the monster was different from usual, perhaps a variant of the species. Lim Sion, however, didn't see anything unusual in the creature. Hyuntae, clenching his fists in anger, struck the wall. He questioned why they were acting like those monsters were something extraordinary. His frustration was evident. Before anyone could respond, Li Mia approached. Her body was covered in the blood of the monsters she had fought. The bloodthirsty look in her eyes revealed the intensity of the battle. With a cold tone, she announced that she had cleared the second area. Huan Juno turned to her, irritated. He reminded her that she shouldn't act alone, and with a reproachful voice, stated that no one else was there to protect her. Li Mia replied that she understood the situation perfectly. Tension in the group rose when the protagonist's name was mentioned. He was the reason they were all in that situation. Huang Juno, furious, denied this possibility, claiming Yu Jia-han wasn't needed there. Meanwhile, the protagonist, focused, delivered precise strikes, tearing apart the monster with his skill. Kim Sai-hu, watching him, was shocked. She couldn't understand how he had managed to defeat such a gigantic creature alone, and wondered how someone could be that strong. Kim Sai-hu looked at the mangled corpse, perplexed. Had he really managed to eliminate a monster of that size? With a smile, Yu Jia-han saw it as a true gold mine. Kim Sai-hu ran to him, calling his name and noticing his injuries. Before she could say anything, he collapsed to the ground, exhausted. She immediately approached, holding him and asking if he was alright. Still catching his breath, he gave a tired smile and joked about needing to farm more since those monsters were rare and valuable. Her expression shifted to fury. She was worried, but he still dared to joke about the situation. In a burst of anger, she punched him in the stomach, scolding him. Looking at the monster remains, Kim Sai-hu noticed the absurd number of bodies scattered around. She asked if he didn't also think it was strange. He acknowledged it might be hard for the two of them to handle everything alone. At that moment, a man approached. With a casual tone, he suggested they shouldn't refuse help. He greeted them while removing his glasses. His demeanor exuded confidence. Jang Se-am introduced himself as a representative of Mongding to get rich. Suddenly, a wall of stone rose around him. His expression turned to surprise. Kim Sai-hu, noticing the situation, asked what was happening. Yu Jia-han tried to free himself, screaming and begging to be spared. He claimed he would return the magic crystal if necessary. Doha, cold and harsh, stated that businessmen like that one had the nasty habit of trying to take what wasn't theirs. With overwhelming strength, he grabbed the man and asked how he dared to steal someone else's item. Kim Sai-hu, watching the scene, was surprised by his strength. Doha, with an ironic smile, held the magic crystal. Yu Jia-han wondered if that was truly the first-class hero Doha. Kim Sai-hu, stunned, called him by name and asked what guild member was doing there. The protagonist, picking up the crystal from the ground, declared that the item belonged to their guild. Then he asked Doha, ironically, if the first-class hero really intended to rob them. Doha, keeping the same provocative tone, replied that he was just following orders from the association, which mandated the collection of that type of species. Yu Jia-han, clearly dissatisfied, activated his skill, sensing imminent danger. A system window appeared, stating that his chance of victory was 0%. He scratched his head, realizing he had misunderstood the situation in the worst possible way. Suddenly, Doha vanished. Before he could react, the protagonist was caught off guard. Doha appeared behind him, ready to attack. With no room to resist, Doha grabbed his face and, with brutal force, slammed him into the ground. The impact was devastating. With a warning tone, he declared that this was just a demonstration of what could happen if he kept acting that way. The young elementalist, consumed by rage, could only wonder why he had encountered that man there. He was the leader of one of the largest guilds in Korea, Dice, and the only Earth elementalist in the entire world. He was a transcendent hero known as the Earth Dragon. Kim Sai-hu, outraged, pointed her staff at him, demanding that he step away from Yu Jia-han. Doha, without hesitation, responded that it would be better for her to stay right where she was. He pressed Yu Jia-han even harder against the ground, stating that otherwise he would die. Kim Sai-hu, furious, realized that this man was serious. The protagonist, activating his skill, confidently replied that the only one dying here would be Doha. However, he was wrong. Yu Jia-han activated the skill Wind Knight, launching Doha far away with a powerful gust of wind. Doha, surprised, questioned how that had happened. Had he really been thrown to the ground? He couldn't believe he'd been tossed like that. It was then that he realized what had truly happened. Summoning the elements, he reduced the impact of the fall, concealing his true power while counterattacking. That border was interesting. A system window appeared in front of Yu Jia-han, informing him that if he continued using elemental magic, The probability of death was 95%. He realized he had already spent all of his remaining mana on that attack. However, it hadn't been enough to cause real damage to Doha. It was clear that first-class heroes did exist. Yu Jiahan understood that he was no match for him. Doha, releasing a powerful magic aura, looked down at him as a junior. After exchanging opening blows, he announced that they could move on to the second round. With a confident smile, he asked who would strike first. To his surprise, the protagonist threw a magic crystal into his hands. Raising his hands, he declared his surrender. Doha was furious. How could he just surrender now? Yu Jiahan asked what his real objective was. If all he wanted was the magic crystal, there was no need to continue fighting. Doha hesitated. If he accepted the surrender, he would have to obey the surrender declaration as stated in paragraph 9, Article 38 of the Hero Act. Annoyed, he mumbled that he was just looking to have some fun. He turned to the side but then noticed something. The association members had arrived. Kim Sai-hu looked up and recognized the Hero Association's helicopter. A woman shouted from the helicopter, reproaching Doha. She wanted to know why he had come there alone. Doha, unfazed, held up the magic crystal and stated that his mission was already complete. Therefore, there was no need for scolding. Soon after, the team disembarked. Doha smiled and suggested they settle the outcome of the fight later. Curious, he asked for the protagonist's name. Yu Jiahan introduced himself formally as a member of the Guild Fun. Doha repeated the name of the guild, intrigued. Then he made an unexpected offer. He said he would personally recommend them for the 4th class promotion test. Yu Jiahan was surprised. Why would he do that? Doha simply replied that he wanted to make sure the helicopter took off soon. He asked Kim Sai-hu if she had heard what he said. He told her to handle the recommendation letter. He then reminded them that the test was in 2 days. How would they get a recommendation so quickly? Besides, their guild wasn't even officially registered. Kim Sai-hu, looking at Yu Jiahan, noticed something strange. He was injured. How was that possible? Yu Jiahan smiled. He said he was going to have a lot of fun with this. Sometime later, back at the guild, one of the members knelt down guilt-ridden. He admitted he was wrong. Yu Jiahan, furious, clenched his fists. He said it was time to stop apologizing. Blacksmith. After all, everyone knew that dwarves were a race of first-class blacksmiths, renowned for crafting weapons of exceptional quality. It was no surprise that any hero would want to meet them. The young woman watched him with excitement, thrilled to finally see a dwarf up close. To her, the weapons crafted by his race were legendary, boasting S-rank quality. The protagonist shared her excitement as she smiled with satisfaction. Turning to him, she commented that he didn't seem so bad, not even for the respective director of Monting. She couldn't believe they had been brought to a workshop run by a dwarf. However, upon looking again in his direction, she was surprised to see that he had disappeared. Doubt crept into her mind. Where had he gone? Then, a laugh echoed through the room. The voice carried amusement, but also a touch of irony. He knew they were all mistaken. Though they believed they were facing a dwarf, they were wrong. With a smile on his face, he claimed to be just a human, born in Korea. The revelation left her in disbelief. Her expression quickly changed, showing how difficult it was to process that information. To her, there was no doubt. He was a dwarf. Her voice rose into a shout full of frustration as she accused him of trying to deceive them. Another member of the group, equally skeptical, pointed at him, demanding he show his ID. He simply laughed, though his gaze remained serious. Without hesitation, he took out his documents and handed them over for verification. With a firm expression, he stated they could check for themselves. The documents were examined carefully. The young woman was shocked to realize that they were indeed authentic human records. Yu Jiahan, still puzzled, asked to see them too. His eyes scanned the papers as an expression of surprise appeared on his face. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. What caught his attention the most was the recorded age, 27 years old. However, the photo didn't resemble the supposed dwarf at all. Doubt immediately arose. How was that possible? Could the identity have been stolen? His mind buzzed with questions as he cast a suspicious glance at the man. The idea of reporting the case to the police was brought up indignantly. Frustration overtook the young woman, who held her head in irritation. She felt deceived and began to suspect they had once again been tricked by the Muntin Company. While the tension grew, he remained calm. In a polite manner, or at least trying to sound that way, he suggested they call the police. However, his gaze soon shifted to something that caught his attention. His eyes landed on the weapon, analyzing it closely. A question formed in his mind: was that really what he thought it was? He felt the urge to examine it more carefully and without hesitation made the request. As he held it, his expression changed slightly. A specific detail in the markings engraved on the blade caught his attention. After a brief pause, he concluded that it belonged to a wind elementalist. His observation was met with surprise by the weapon's owner, who immediately asked how he had figured that out. Without breaking eye contact, the blacksmith explained that a first-class professional could recognize the weapon's owner just by the marks left on it. Unfortunately, he concluded that it wouldn't be able to withstand the power of the elements. Determined to find a solution, he began searching his workshop. He needed time, as he had the perfect weapon for elementalists. After a few minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for. With confidence, he handed over the new weapon, stating that it was made to harmonize with the elements. The artifact's name was Nam Ho Yi, Upon hearing the name, the young woman stared at him with a melancholic expression. Doubt crept in. Had he named the weapon after himself? Days later, at the long-awaited promotion exam, the hall was filled with heroes seeking class advancement. The atmosphere was thick with the anxiety of the participants. Kim Sae-hoo felt a tightness in her chest as she looked at the crowd around her. The nervousness was clear on her face. Yoo Jae-han, for his part, recalled his own 4th class test, which had taken place a long time ago, back when he was still a member of the Heroes Guild. At that time, just like now, the hall was full of anxious candidates. The activity in the room was interrupted by laughter. One of the heroes present commented mockingly that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He recognized one of the candidates. It was hard to imagine that the guy who had been expelled from the Heroes was trying to surpass him without a solid plan. Soon after, the system sounded, announcing that the 12th team had failed the test. Kim Han-seok expressed concern, asking if Bang Yoon-sik hadn't gone overboard. Oh Hae-in, meanwhile, doubted anyone could actually pass the exam. Seo Jung-woo, a 4th class examiner, said that 5th class participants always made the same mistakes. Oh Hae-in, another examiner, harshly asked how she was supposed to report the situation to her superiors. Seo Jung-woo then announced that the last team to appear would be the Fun Guild. He analyzed them and concluded they were the next candidates, as they had received a special recommendation from the leader of the Dice Guild, making the test even more challenging. Meanwhile, the protagonist watched the examination hall closely, its gaze fixed on someone who had just entered. Reflecting on the situation, he concluded that the person didn't seem very flexible. In fact, it was the team leader from the Dice Guild, the one responsible for conducting the 4th class promotion test. The system sounded again, welcoming the participants and explaining the test rules. Over the next 5 minutes, the candidates would have to fight the examiner. To pass, they had to either completely defeat him or earn his confirmation that they had met the necessary requirements. One of the participants, outraged, exclaimed that it was impossible for a 5th class team to defeat an examiner. The protagonist reflected on the challenge's difficulty. He knew that the examiner had fought many teams and hadn't suffered even a scratch. Turning to his companion, he asked her to help him attack from behind, just like they had done in the monster territory. She understood his plan and agreed to follow it. Aware of the battle's difficulty, he activated his skill and prepared for combat. The system's sound echoed through the area, announcing the official start of the 4th class exam. Without delay, the examiner launched a direct attack on the protagonist, attempting to kick his weapon away. However, he held firm and analyzed the situation. An attack right at the start of the test signaled that the opponent wouldn't underestimate anyone. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the environment. The protagonist's companion shouted his name, worried. The examiner tried to strike her, but was surprised to see the protagonist shielding her with his wind ability. The young man felt satisfied for managing to block the attack and reassured himself that the letter of recommendation wasn't fake. However, the examiner broke through his defense and delivered a powerful kick to her. Seizing the opportunity, he immediately charged toward the protagonist. The battle grew increasingly intense. He realized how difficult it was. He hadn't imagined a wooden weapon could cause so much damage. He knew he needed to keep some distance to reorganize his strategy. Without hesitation, he activated his Wind Knight skill, creating a gust of wind that launched his opponent far away. The move was executed with precision, and he didn't lose his balance. The examiner, irritated, acknowledged that it was wind magic and commented on how annoyingly talented it was. Determined to counterattack, he activated the accelerate skill and struck from behind. At that moment, Jae Ki-young questioned the examiner's decision. If he had indeed written a letter of recommendation, wouldn't that become a problem for them? The Fun Guild was struggling, and the presence of that candidate made everything more complicated. Doha, however, laughed and explained that he had done it because that young man was one of a kind, a swordsman capable of slicing through the wind. Back at the exam site, Eunuch activated his skill, Line and Slash, delivering a quick blow against the protagonist. This time, however, his speed seemed slower than before. The young man still felt the effects of previous battles against the Basilisk and noticed that his weapon consumed an absurd amount of mana. The examiner, with an arrogant look, asked if he had received the recommendation letter solely because of that skill. If that were the case, he would destroy him right then and there without mercy. Kim Sae-hoo, sensing the danger, activated her skill and yelled for him to leave the protagonist alone. But the examiner easily dodged the attack and hesitated for a moment before saying something. Kim Sae-hoo took the chance to intervene and insisted that he let her handle it. She knew she couldn't hide behind the protagonist forever. She had to act. The examiner, however, rudely asked why she didn't just back off. She in turn refused to give in, calling him stupid and proudly revealing her identity. Showing off her pointed ears, she declared herself the leader of the Fun Guild. The examiner, surprised, smiled. So she was an elf after all. Unlike an ordinary mage, she dared to face him directly. He activated his skill and rudely stated that he expected her to try something. The elf, however, trusted in her abilities. She knew that elves could hear the flow of mana, and because of that, she managed to dodge the attacks effortlessly. Activating the wind arrow skill, she fired straight at the examiner. He blocked the attack with his weapon and mocked her. He found it ridiculous to think such a simple move could work on him. However, at that moment, he felt something strange behind him. Turning around, he saw another magic being activated. In an instant, he was surrounded by a complex seven-sided spell, something he never would have expected from a 5th class candidate. The young woman activated her slow wind skill, immobilizing him. The spell struck its target head-on, covering him in a thick magical mist. She was convinced she had landed a hit. Even for an examiner, there was no way he could come out of that unscathed. However, to her shock, he reappeared behind her, placing his weapon at her neck. With a calm smile, he admitted that her plan to corner him was good, but unfortunately, far too slow. The protagonist, seeing the situation, prepared to strike. She looked at him, surprised. With a burst of mana, he declared that the examiner would lose due to his own arrogance. He knew his weapon could no longer absorb any more mana, and he had already used nearly all of his reserves. Still, he was determined to concentrate everything he had left into a single powerful strike. Sometime later, at the Heroes Guild, Park Jung-seop was looking out the window. His secretary held a set of documents and announced that it was the daily status report from Kim Hyun-tae's team. Curious, he asked whether the new member Kim Kang-woo was adapting quickly. He explained that this was the young man he had sent to Kim Hyun-tae's team after Yoo Jae-han was eliminated. The test reports indicated that he was still in the adaptation phase and showing some instability. However, Park Jung-seop believed that team leader Kim Hyun-tae would be able to stabilize him, as the new team member was far more useful than Yoo Jae-han. One of the staff members nervously reported that some information had surfaced about the one who had been expelled from the team. The Heroes Guild leader, intrigued, asked what it was about. The staff reported that they had discovered Yoo Jae-han had passed the class promotion test. The guild leader was shocked by the news, barely able to contain his mana. On the promotion test field, a broken wooden sword lay on the ground. The protagonist had the blade of his weapon positioned against the examiner's neck. Watching the scene, he laughed to himself as he tried to understand how Yoo Jae-han had managed to get a recommendation from Doha. With a sigh, the examiner admitted defeat and declared that he was giving up. To him, sending an elementalist to the according to them, they should be allowed to escape. Yoo Jae-han and Kim Si-hoo found themselves surrounded by a crowd. The protagonist asked if this was some kind of joke. A woman with purple hair screamed in horror and begged to be allowed to see. She sobbed while stroking the corpse of a monster. Crying, she asked how they could commit such an atrocity. A man with black hair was also crying, humming the creature's body. He declared on behalf of all humanity that he apologized to her. The woman with purple hair asked how they could still call themselves heroes after what they had done. The man with black hair, furious, rudely demanded whether they were really heroes or just murderers. Yoo Jae-han felt his patience wearing thin. After all, heroes weren't allowed to lay hands on ordinary civilians. He knew he had to make a decision. Should they hold out until the Hero Association sent reinforcements, or should they take a different course of action? Before he could respond, a familiar voice echoed through the crowd. The individual demanded they get out of the way. The protagonist was surprised to recognize the voice. Suddenly, the person releases mana, making his intent clear. The man with black hair shouted furiously, using harsh words to ask who he was. Doha, approaching, sarcastically asked if he really didn't know. With a gesture, he used magic to raise a wall behind him. Then he firmly declared that he was the one they hated the most. With a smile, Doha welcomed them. The protagonist, irritated, immediately recognized the Earth Elementalist, known by the nickname Earth Dragon. It was a name feared by some, a joke to others. In the West, he was also called Earthquake. As he planted his foot on the ground, Doha sank slightly into the soil, adjusting his glasses with his middle finger. Then with an amused smile, he declared that the nickname he liked most was Scoundrel. The crowd was taken by surprise. One of the protesters exclaimed Doha's name in shock, while another, an ally, questioned why a first-rate hero was there. The protagonist couldn't hide his frustration. It seemed that man only showed up to cause trouble, as if he had nothing better to do. Ignoring the murmurs around him, Doha turned to the protesters and, without hesitation, ordered them to return to hell. At that moment, a colossal figure emerged beside him, a massive stone elemental, who opened its mouth menacingly. Yoo Jae-han felt his muscles tense. The sight of the creature stirred unease. That was Doha's elemental. Without delay, the spirit obeyed its master's command. Beams of energy shot from its mouth, speeding toward the protesters. Terrified, they tried to flee, but the energy clung to their bodies like living roots, lifting them into the air without harming them. Cries of outrage soon followed. The protesters demanded to be released, questioning whether that was how a national hero should treat civilians. Kim Si-hoo, stunned by the scene, raised his hands to his head, unable to believe what he was seeing. The protagonist, on the other hand, analyzed the situation closely. He noticed that despite the apparent brutality, Doha had managed to restrain everyone without hurting them. His control was so precise it bordered on unbelievable. After confirming that the protesters were no longer a threat, Doha turned to the group of heroes, apologizing for the delay. His expression remained relaxed, as if nothing unusual had happened. The heroes exchanged glances, surprised by his unexpected presence. With his hands in the pockets of his shorts, he approached and mentioned he'd heard about their promotion exam to 4th class. Yoo Jae-han was surprised by the comment, recalling the recent fight against a monster. Without hesitation, Doha credited their success to the examiner he had chosen for them. The laughter that followed revealed amusement, but also carried a hint of irony. He seemed to find this situation fascinating. His unpredictable temperament made it hard to grasp his true intentions. The protagonist, however, vividly remembered the danger he had faced. He had almost lost his life during that exam. Doha then looked over the group and commented that Yu Jae-han had gotten stronger. Next, he expressed curiosity about which of them was stronger now. Suspicion grew on the protagonist's face. He wondered if Doha had come all that way just to say that. Before he could go deeper into the matter, other guild members approached, intrigued. Doha's name echoed among surprised whispers. Many didn't understand his presence in a fourth-class territory and questioned his connection to that team. Kim Sai-hoo, noticing the commotion around them, turned to Yu Jae-han, clearly concerned about how many people were watching. Doha, meanwhile, expressed his annoyance at the excessive attention. It was better for them to change locations. Soon after, the group headed to a closed-off construction site. Workers continued their tasks, unaware of their presence. One of the workers noticed Doha and approached, greeting him casually before asking if he shouldn't be working. Doha replied with a carefree smile, waving his hand. He claimed he was too tired for that. Yu Jae-han, observing the interaction, looked around and reflected on the place. Was this the headquarters of the Dice Guild? The number of people present suggested it was. Doha then clarified they were expanding the underground training center. Though the noise was bothersome, he asked the group to be patient. The protagonist nodded, understanding the situation. After a few minutes, they entered a tall building protected by a magical barrier. As soon as they crossed the entrance, Yu Jae-han felt something odd. The noise from the construction site vanished completely. It felt like being in a quiet cafe without customers. Kim Sai-hoo, impressed by what he saw, looked around in awe. To him, it was incredible that such a large structure could be completely enclosed by a magical barrier. The investment required for such a feat must have been outrageous. He concluded the guild must have taken a loan to fund such infrastructure. After all, as one of the largest organizations, they didn't hesitate to spend money on their headquarters. Yu Jae-han, still curious, asked whether that truly required so many resources. He pointed to the barrier and confirmed without hesitation. She briefly analyzed it and made an estimate. At least 20 billion had been spent on the installation. The revelation left the protagonist stunned. It was an absurd amount. He wondered if the guild really had the resources to spend like that. At that moment, a figure approached the group. It was Park Jae-hyung, vice leader of the Dice Guild. Adjusting her glasses, she smiled and thanked them for their interest in the magical barrier. She then commented that they had nearly guessed the exact value. Yu Jae-han, surprised, recognized her. Kim Sai-hoo, beside him, seemed to have misunderstood, thinking Park Jae-hyung was just an ordinary secretary. Doha then walked over to her and greeted her familiarly. He took the opportunity to remind her of the fun guild they had met earlier and asked her to prepare everything for the meeting. Doha asked Park Jae-hyung to get everything ready immediately. She promptly replied that she would, but then grabbed his cheek indignantly. Her voice carried a tone of reprimand as she asked him where he had been that day, completely ignoring the schedule. Doha shouted in pain, surprised by her reaction, and exclaimed in disbelief. He asked how she dared treat the guild master that way. Park Jae-hyung, without hesitation, firmly replied that if he really was the guild master, then he should act like it. Watching the chaotic scene, the protagonist couldn't help but think that, whether inside or outside the building, the environment remained noisy. After a while, everyone settled into the office. Doha grabbed a glass of drink for himself and, without beating around the bush, asked the group what they thought had brought them there. The protagonist analyzed the question and wondered if the reason had to do with Doha's elemental. The Earth Elementalist took a small sip of his drink before confirming with a slight smile that the guess was correct. At that moment, a bright light appeared on the table. The protagonist looked in surprise at the source of the glow, only to see Mumu, Doha's small elemental dog, emerge from it. Doha stroked his partner and encouraged the others to say hello. He introduced him formally, emphasizing that Mumu was his elemental partner. It was the first time the group had seen him. Recalling how Mumu handled the protesters, Yu Jae-han realized the stark contrast between his cute appearance and immense power. Mumu explained he had been helping with construction and was quite busy. Doha, however, assured him it would only take a minute of his time. The elemental then turned his attention to Yu Jae-han, observing him in surprise before asking if he was the guest. Yu Jae-han, feeling slightly uncomfortable, awkwardly waved and greeted Mumu. A small elemental approached and began sniffing his outstretched hands. Kim Sai-hoo, watching the scene curiously, was impressed by the creature's behavior. The protagonist, on the other hand, internally questioned what Mumu was trying to do. Then Doha asked Yu Jae-han directly if he could release his own elemental. Yu Jae-han confirmed with a nod, and in the next moment, a sphere of energy formed in his hand before flying toward the Earth Elemental. Mumu watched the energy and, recognizing its essence, exclaimed that it was an elemental. Doha, analyzing the interaction, stated that, as expected, was a wind elemental. Curious, he asked what its name was. Yu Jae-han responded immediately, Self. Doha repeated the name to himself and then revealed the reason he had brought them there. He explained that during his 17 years as an elementalist, only one elemental had ever been discovered in the country, Mumu, and that situation had never changed. Although he had studied various hero dossiers, he had never found any mention of a wind elemental. The only clue was Yu Jae-han's guild switch, but concluding that he had obtained an elemental just because of that seemed premature. It was something unprecedented. He then questioned how Yu Jae-han had managed to form a contract with the spirit of wind. The protagonist exchanged glances with Kim Si-hoo, hesitating before responding. Kim Si-hoo in turn placed a hand on her chest and offered to explain. She revealed that Self had already had another master before. Essential. To them, that was the organization's true mission, because one day others would come to see that too. Suddenly, however, tension took over the room. The panic on their faces betrayed what was coming. Both turned around, horrified, upon realizing something wasn't right. One of them murmured, worried, and it seemed like feeding time. Her gaze turned to the cage where a saber-toothed tiger exuded a malicious aura, showing impatience. She concluded that it was indeed the right time for the children to have a snack, and so she turned to her colleague, asking what they should offer. The other suggested it be something lighter. As they reviewed their options, one of the employees noticed the presence of an elderly woman tied up on the floor, her mouth sealed with duct tape. The woman's desperate eyes met hers. With an indifferent expression, the young woman remarked that the old lady was still alive. Her colleague, crossing his arms, noted that for someone her age she seemed rather playful. The elderly woman tried to speak, but the sound that came out was just a muffled moan. Without hesitation, the employee opened the cage and shoved her inside. The impact of the fall caused her to let out a cry of pain. As she watched the scene, the female worker casually said that this was the meal of the day. Tears streamed down the old woman's face as her body trembled with fear. The saber-toothed tiger slowly approached, opening its mouth and revealing its massive fangs. In the next moment, blood splattered across the room. The young woman, bringing a hand to her lips, smiled maniacally and commented that her cat looked adorable while eating. She then turned to her colleague and suggested with an eager look that maybe it would be a good idea to bring in more people to feed the beast. She raised her index finger and warned not to overfeed them, suggesting they'd bring just one more for dinner. Next, she turned around and noticed a car approaching, its headlights illuminating the path ahead. Her colleague, upon noticing the vehicle, exclaimed in surprise that it looked like the manager was arriving. From the car emerged the manager of the Korean branch of the IUPC, Min-soo Lim, holding documents. With a smile on his face, the manager greeted the team, saying hello to everyone. The employees quickly gathered around him. One of the workers greeted him excitedly, asking how his business trip had gone. Min-soo Lim at the front replied that he had brought many adorable and kind children, who were in the building next door and could be seen later. One of the employees, impressed, praised the manager, calling him a true hero. Min-soo Lim then stepped up to the board, opened his arms, and asked for everyone's attention, announcing that he had good news. The employees, setting aside their tasks, turned to him with anticipation. With a calculated gesture, he opened his briefcase and revealed that the prototype of the object his partners had been researching for a long time was finally ready. He pulled out a weapon with an unusual appearance, catching the attention of one employee, who asked in surprise what it was. Min-soo Lim, confident, approached the cage and asked if they remembered the basilisk recently discovered in the land of monsters in Bucheon. He explained that although they had managed to create a new variant by feeding the creature magical crystals, its body quickly decayed, and there were control issues. Observing the monster in the cage, he added that this time would be different. With a threatening smile, he pointed the weapon at the creature and declared that his child would be even better. He fired a single shot, causing the cage to light up. He then sighed and began to clap, joined by his colleagues. With satisfaction, he declared that it was indeed a magnificent creature. Sometime later, in the 4th class of the saber-toothed tiger's activity site, someone noticed that unlike the previous day, there was now a barrier. With a hand on their face, they reflected on the conflict with the IUPC and concluded that they had realized the saber-toothed tigers wouldn't be eliminated quickly. If they were lucky, maybe they could obtain a magical crystal of that variety that day. Kim Si-hoo, surprised, looked at the protagonist, but before she could speak, Jang Se-im appeared behind him, grabbed his shoulders, and exclaimed indignantly that Yu Jae-han had disappeared the previous day. The shock made Kim Si-hoo bring her hand to her chest, gasping in alarm. Yu Jae-han to get there. Moon Hyun-jin smiled and commented that those people seemed to not even understand Korean. He explained that a point was a strategic location to secure an advantageous position within the monster territory. If a large guild took a point, the other guilds had to respect that position, especially if the guild in question only had 2 people. Then he shouted that if they had understood, they should leave immediately. The protagonist, however, responded that it would be better if they disappeared. He pointed out that the Fun Guild wasn't an ordinary guild. He said he was aware of the rule against occupying monster territories and would file a formal complaint with the Ministry of Heroes about their actions. Moon Hyun-jin crossed his arms over his chest. The veins on his face bulged with rage. Furious, he declared that this guy was insane. Drawing his sword from its sheath, he threatened, asking if Yu Jae-han really believed the Ministry of Heroes would take responsibility for their lives. Yu Jae-han, intrigued, asked if that was a threat. He began to analyze the situation. In front of him stood a tank, 2 warriors, and a mage. Considering the layout of the place and the group's strategic position, he concluded it would be difficult to take all 4 down at once. They believed they had a good chance of winning. The system window confirmed that confidence, indicating an 80% chance of success. However, the warrior from the Knife Guild wasn't intimidated and charged at Yu Jia-han, shouting defiantly. The protagonist reacted quickly, blocking Moon Hyung-jin's attack with his sword without any hesitation. The enemy, surprised, realized that his strike had done nothing and turned to his allies, demanding they attack. The mage of the group, holding a book in one hand, raised the other to indicate he was ready to act. At the same time, Kim Sai-hoo prepared her spell, creating a magical symbol in the air with her staff. Soon after, she launched a water arrow against the enemy's fire magic, resulting in a powerful explosion in the middle of the battlefield. With the smoke barrier clearing, the heroes charged forward without hesitation. Moon Hyun-jin noticed the movement and alerted his guild, ordering them to chase after them. Kim Sai-hoo, however, acted first and formed a magic seal, conjuring a wall of fire to block the path. As the battle intensified, Yu Jia-han swung his sword through the air and attacked Moon Hyun-jin again. The warrior tried to defend himself, positioning his blade in front of him, but his hands trembled visibly. He struggled to understand how an opponent of the same rank as him could be so superior. Without giving him time to react, Yu Jia-han noticed the enemy was already weakened and struck him with a kick, knocking him to the ground. Moon Hyun-jin, outraged, protested, claiming his guild wouldn't let this go unpunished. Yu Jia-han, unfazed, drove the sword into the concrete next to the fallen warrior's head and calmly asked whether the guild would really take responsibility for their lives. The mage from the Knife Guild hesitated before admitting that they had no chance of winning that fight. Kim Sai-hoo, holding her staff in one hand and a fire orb in the other, suggested that perhaps it would be best to end the confrontation right there. Moon Hyun-jin looked at her in astonishment, realizing that his group was dealing with opponents far more powerful than he had imagined. With no other options, he ordered them to extinguish the fire conjured by Kim Sai-hoo. However, the mage responsible for water magic needed more time to cast his spell. Meanwhile, the group's tank, frustrated, grumbled about the lack of progress in the search for the saber-toothed tigers, believing they were just wasting energy. His complaint, however, was abruptly cut short. Something moved quickly in the shadows, and before he could react, the tank was seized by a gigantic creature. His screams of despair echoed through the area as the monster sank its fangs into his skull, killing him instantly. Horror spread among the members of the Knife Guild. Kim Sai-hoo, watching the scene, placed a hand on her chest and commented that they had heard screams coming from the emergency stairwell. Yu Jia-han, picking up on this information, immediately understood what was happening. His gaze sharpened. He activated his scanning ability and waited for the system's response. A window appeared before him, revealing a worrying result. The probability of Yu Jia-han leaving that place alive was only 0.5%. Yu Jia-han observed the monster in front of them and recognized it as a variation of the saber-toothed cat. The group looked at the creature in pure horror, and Kim Sai-hoo questioned whether that thing could really be a saber-toothed cat. The protagonist reflected that perhaps it was some kind of deity, as he had never seen such an impressive creature. The members of the Knife Guild were equally terrified, their bodies trembling before the threat. The guild's mage, in a state of shock, exclaimed, asking what kind of hellish creature that was. Moon Hyung-jin, hesitant and overcome by fear, suggested that it might be an even rarer variation. Yu Jia-han tried to coordinate a defense, shouting for everyone to unite. However, Moon Hyung-jin and the mage had already turned their backs and were fleeing in terror. Outraged, Yu Jia-han shouted for them to stop, reminding them that 4 people alone couldn't handle that threat. But seeing them disappear, he realized the magnitude of the problem and cursed their cowardice. He knew that facing that beast with just 2 people was complete suicide. The monster charged rapidly, and Yu Jia-han understood that an attack was imminent. Without wasting time, he drew his sword and attempted to block the blow. The creature's strength was absurd, and he felt his body tremble. Had his blade not been coated with elemental magic, it would have snapped in 2. He realized that he couldn't just defend himself. He needed to end the fight quickly. At that moment, Kim Sai-hoo cast a wind spell to slow the monster down and shouted for Yu Jia-han to strike. He charged forward with determination, activating his wind blades for a decisive blow. For a moment, he thought he had succeeded, but before he could react, the monster dodged with surprising agility. In the next moment, a giant paw struck him, hurling him violently against a wall. Dazed, Yu Jia-han wondered how the monster could be so fast. Kim Sai-hoo screamed his name in concern and fired wind arrows at the creature. The saber-toothed cat dodged the attacks easily and prepared for a counterattack. Kim Sai-hoo realized in horror that she wouldn't be able to dodge in time. At that moment, Minuri's voice echoed, calling out for Chilla. The small chinchilla leaped toward the monster in a swift motion. With a powerful impact, the creature was thrown against the wall, breaking through it and crashing out of the building. Kim Sai-hoo stood in shock at the sight and murmured Chilla's name in disbelief. Minuri approached calmly, explaining that they had heard the explosion and came to check on the situation. She smiled upon recognizing the members of the Fun Guild, saying she was happy to see them again. Kim Sai-hoo, still surprised, recognized Minuri's name. Minuri then turned her attention to Yu Jia-han, commenting that they would have been in serious trouble if she had arrived a bit later. She looked at the hole in the wall and said she would take care of the creature, asking the group to retrieve Moon Hyun-jin along with Yu Jia-han. Kim Sai-hoo hesitated, doubting that Minuri could handle that monster alone. She suggested calling for reinforcements from other heroes. Minuri, however, reassured her, stating that she knew the saber-toothed tigers better than anyone. Kim Sai-hoo noticed that something in Minuri's aura had changed. The next moment, the huntress leaped out of the opening in the wall. Shilla knocked the monster to the ground, making it tremble from the impact. Minuri quickly ordered her companion to retreat and then cast her freezing rain spell. The attack enveloped the creature in ice, sealing it completely. For a moment, it seemed the battle was over, but then the monster roared and shattered the ice around it, breaking free. Minuri jumped onto Chilla's back, surprised by the enemy's resilience. Even after being hit by countless ice arrows, it could still stand. She reflected that this variation really did possess unusual strength. The saber-toothed cat growled, fixing its gaze on them. Without hesitation, Minuri gathered her energy for a final attack, declaring that the outcome wouldn't change. She launched a high-speed snow shot at the beast. However, to her surprise, the monster created multiple copies of itself. She understood that this saber-toothed tiger possessed both great strength and a specific weakness. In the next moment, the real monster collapsed to the ground, defeated. She commented that it wouldn't be able to get up again. She concluded that the abnormal agility of that species came from the flexibility of its muscles. However, when exposed to cold, the muscles contracted, making movement impossible. Without functional joints, the body couldn't support its own weight and collapsed. She adjusted the glove on her hand and declared that the battle had ended the moment her ice arrow hit the target. Watching the scene from above, Kim Sai-hoo couldn't believe what had just happened. The creature she and Yoo Jae-han had struggled so much to fight had been defeated before their eyes. The protagonist called out to her, and she immediately turned anxious. He warned that they needed to help Minuri immediately. She assured him there was nothing more to worry about, as everything was already resolved. However, Yoo Jae-han insisted, saying that wasn't quite true. A system window appeared before him. The message revealed that the probability of Minuri defeating the saber-toothed tiger was less than 10%. He realized, alarmed, that she was still in danger. Minuri approached the fallen monster, preparing to deliver the final blow. She murmured that she would end it in the least painful way possible. However, before she could strike, the monster opened its mouth and let out a powerful roar. At that moment, several saber-toothed tigers in the area began running toward her. Kim Sai-hoo, holding Yoo Jae-han by the waist, watched the scene with urgency. She realized the roar had summoned all the nearby saber-toothed cats. The protagonist understood what was happening and realized they were in a desperate situation. He turned to Kim Sai-hoo and asked if she could use levitation. She replied hesitantly that her technique wasn't perfect, but she could manage it to some extent. Without hesitation, Yoo Jae-han grabbed her waist and said it was enough. Kim Sai-hoo shouted, outraged, asking where he thought he was putting his hands. Ignoring her complaint, Yoo Jae-han held her hand firmly and made a decision. With a single motion, he pulled her close and activated his acceleration. Kim Sai-hoo's eyes widened, feeling the sudden speed. Tears formed in her eyes as she screamed desperately for him to wait. She realized, too late, that he hadn't even explained what he was about to do. The monsters advanced toward Minuri, but she destroyed them with ease using her attacks. Suddenly, one of them tried to surprise her from behind. However, Shilla pinned it to the ground with a precise blow. Upon observing the remaining enemies, Minuri realized there were many of them. Wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket, she mentally questioned where such creatures could have been hiding and concluded that they needed to resolve this situation quickly before it spiraled out of control. At that moment, Yoo Jae-han shouted to Kim Sai-hoo he used levitation. She responded by warning that she had already done so. He quickly realized she could slow the enemies down, but her strength wasn't enough to keep them suspended. Although he wanted to conserve mana, he realized there was no other choice. He concentrated energy in his hand and launched a wind bomb forward. Sai-hoo wanted to know if they had worked. Yoo Jae-han charged forward, understanding he had to aim with the same precision he used to destroy the basilisk of the variant type. Using his wind blade, he cut through multiple monsters, causing destruction all around. Upon landing, he supported himself on his sword, breathing heavily. It was clear he was trying to use his mana as efficiently as possible, though it was physically draining. Minuri quickly approached and, annoyed, reminded the group that she had asked them to stay back. The protagonist turned around, stood up, and asked seriously if that was all she had to say after they came to help her. Minuri replied, irritated, that she didn't need anyone's help and that she could handle everything on her own. The protagonist then asked what was going on with the saber-toothed tigers. Upon hearing the question, Minuri glanced in his direction, while the chinchilla beside her let out an irritated squeak. Shilla looked ahead and, alarmed, realized that the previous attack hadn't eliminated all the enemies. Saber-toothed tigers began emerging from the rubble. The protagonist noticed that these felines weren't the same as before, and the monsters seemed to be summoning more creatures. Surprised, Minuri realized the joints of the main creature had already been restored. Yoo Jae-han declared that he didn't understand how that was possible, but suspected the cat had regenerative abilities, something he had never seen in saber-toothed tigers. Before he could explain further, Minuri recalled her injured sister, begging her to flee during the battle. Looking at her blood-covered hands, she was overtaken by horror. Back in the present, the protagonist walked toward her, turned around, and commented that most of the enemies had already been defeated, while the main one was only lightly injured. He believed that if they all worked together, they could defeat it. However, Minuri didn't listen and rushed ahead. The protagonist, outraged, shouted her name and wondered why she was acting so recklessly, concluding that it was no surprise she preferred working alone. Determined, he asked Saihu to cover him. She ran to him and replied that she understood. Meanwhile, several saber-toothed tigers charged toward the group, but Minuri managed to repel them with her attacks. Soon, she was positioned in front of the main monster. One of the tigers tried to ambush her from behind, and she shouted that she didn't need interference. However, another feline approached her from the side, and Minuri realized in alarm that the monster had regained its strength with incredible speed. When the creature tried to strike her with its paw, the protagonist was already approaching, drawing his sword. He remarked that if he were the monster, he wouldn't eat something cold, as it would cause a stomachache. Then he launched a direct attack with all his energy. The chinchilla followed him, delivering precise blows, while Kim Sai-Hu used her wind magic to pierce the enemy's body. The protagonist was confident that victory was near. He leaped for the final blow, but was stopped by Minuri, who stepped in front of the monster, shielding it with her body, and asked him not to kill it. Surprised, the protagonist stopped and asked what she was doing. He said they needed to destroy the monster before it regenerated, but Minuri insisted she needed a saber-toothed tiger alive because she wanted to capture that rare species without harming it. Not understanding her reasons, the protagonist questioned her sanity, stating that she shouldn't interfere. When Minuri prepared to attack, she hesitated and shouted that she couldn't. The protagonist was furious and asked why she was acting that way. At that exact moment, the saber-toothed tiger behind them began to glow and rose onto its feet. Yu Jia-han watched the scene in horror, wondering what was happening. He realized more tigers were approaching, and Kim Sai-Hu shouted, warning that the monster was calling reinforcements. Yu Jia-han, concerned about his limits, thought his mana was nearly depleted and wondered what they would do next. Suddenly, Junwoo intervened, calling the situation pathetic. He extended his hand forward, channeling energy, and activated gravity control at 9 grams intensity. Kim Sai-Hu, alarmed, asked who they were. Yunsik, observing the others, commented that they still behaved like amateurs. The protagonist furrowed his brow, thinking that even after passing the promotion test, they still couldn't handle a few cats. The disappointment was evident. Hans Su, with an ironic smile, cracked his knuckles and claimed he wasn't a prodigy after all. Hyen in turn admitted she was impressed they had lasted this long. Drawing her sword, she prepared to fight. Yunsik asked them to stop chatting and suggested they finish the battle quickly. Yu Jia-han thought of Bang Yunsik's team. While all of this was happening, Min-Su Lin watched from atop a building. With a slight smile, he commented that the big shots had finally shown up. Looking through binoculars, he said he believed it was the third-class team from the Data Guild. He had hoped a first-class group would join the fight, but it seemed he had waited too long. Then he lowered the binoculars with a smile. A subordinate approached and asked what the next step would be. Min-Su Lin replied that for now, there was nothing else to do and suggested they retreat. Although it wasn't a victory, it hadn't been a defeat either. The only issue was that the mana crystal had dispersed throughout the body at the last moment. Even so, the power stored within it was impressive, and the team would continue to follow the schedule. At that moment, standing among the corpses of the saber-toothed felines, Hans Su questioned in disbelief what was going on. Yunsik replied that it seemed the heroes department would have a lot of work ahead. Both watched anxiously as the mutant monster continued to grow in size. Meanwhile, people wearing special suits were helping the heroes exit from inside the creature. Minuri and Shilla passed through the barrier, and Minuri turned to look back one last time. 1 week later, in the casual building of the guild, the protagonist was lying on the sofa staring at his phone screen. On the screen, it read, 20 casualties per inch in the 4th class monster territory. It was an article addressing the need to revise the current system for classifying monster territories. The text suggested that more discussion was necessary to update the classification of the saber-toothed tiger to meet the criteria of the heroes department. Someone approached and asked what had happened at that place. Clenching his fist, the protagonist replied that the monster territory they had visited had been in the news for several days. According to him, it seemed those involved had gone through many hardships. Without looking away from the corner of the screen, he declared he didn't want to talk about the matter with ordinary people. He added that if Jang Seim insisted, he would make her go through something just as difficult. Jang Seim protested indignantly, saying they were business partners and she had the right to know everything. The protagonist looked up at the ceiling and thought maybe they shouldn't have hired him in the first place. That day, all 8 heroes who entered the monster territory died. The heroes department had severely underestimated the number of saber-toothed tigers hiding in the underground parking lot. The sudden appearance of the species caused panic among the creatures, culminating in a tragedy. He felt a bad premonition about what had happened. Yu Jia-han removed the bandage from his cheek and thought that everything had been too well planned to be just an accident. Furthermore, the species mutation was something he had never seen before. Despite his suspicions, he decided not to dwell too much on it, hoping the heroes department would release the investigation results soon. Jang Seon looked away and commented that she just realized she hadn't seen Kim Sai-Hu that day. The protagonist lowered his head and explained that Kim Sai-Hu had taken a week off to handle personal matters. Suddenly, he noticed his phone ringing. Surprised, he wondered if it was really a call. Monson commented that he had never seen that phone ring before. Yu Jia-han approached and said it was the guild's direct line, the same one all guilds had. In his mind, he questioned who would be calling that line. When he answered, he identified himself as being from the Fun Guild. On the other side of the line, Min Yuri introduced herself. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. Jang Se-am turned toward him, also surprised. Putting on his 3D glasses, Jang Se-am opened his mouth in shock and mentally asked where his popcorn was. Min Yuri apologized for calling the direct line, explaining it was the only way she could contact them. The protagonist replied that he understood. She then asked about his injuries. He explained it had been a week, and his wounds were almost healed. He returned the question, asking how she was doing. Looking out the window, Min Yuri said she was great. There was a brief silence during which the protagonist thought it unlikely she had called just to check on him. Then Min Yuri asked if Yoo Jae-han could meet her that day. Surprised, he repeated the word today. He stood there, mouth agape, still holding popcorn and soda, unable to believe the situation. Meanwhile, Kim Si-hyo answered another call while wrapping a cloth around her staff. She greeted her father, who asked how she was after the encounter with the new species in the 4th class monster territory. He wanted to know if she had been injured. Kim Si-hyo assured him she was fine. Her father warned her to be careful in dangerous areas, reminding her that a hero's support often becomes a target more frequently than expected. Saw closed his eyes, showing irritation, and seriously said he had heard that warning hundreds of times. He emphasized that if they saw invaders, they should just retreat. She replied that she was aware. Her father, Kim Ji-ono, the chief researcher at the Kyoto Monster Research Institute, expressed satisfaction knowing she was working with someone reliable. Kim Si-hyo, a bit embarrassed, said Yoo Jae-han had been a great help to the guild. She said that if she hadn't met him, she would still be stuck. He commented that he would like to meet him someday. He took out a photograph and observed the hero who had inherited his mother's elements. He showed great interest in learning more about him. At that moment, an employee entered the office and informed Kim Ji-ono that he was needed to study a newly arrived sample. Kim Ji-ono adjusted his glasses and said he would be there shortly. He asked them to start without him if necessary. Before leaving, he said he had to go because something had happened. Kim Si-hyo looked at the phone worriedly and asked when he would come to Korea. He answered that he would come for his mother's death anniversary and that they would talk more then. She commented that it was typical for him to say just what was necessary. Then she stretched and said she needed to take care of household chores. At that moment, Jang Se-am called her. Looking at the phone, she wondered why he would be calling now. Later, the protagonist was on the street and recalled when Jang Se-am, smiling, had handed him a bracelet. He said that lucky whiskers would bring good luck. He wished him luck with whatever came his way. The protagonist looked at the bracelet on his hand and thought he only wore it so Jang Se-am would stop whining. Soon after, Min Yuri called him. He turned at the sound of her voice, who asked if he had left her waiting. Looking at her, he thought she seemed different from when they met in the monster territory. He said he had just arrived. She sighed with relief and commented that it was a relief. Then she walked ahead, informing him that she had already reserved a table and suggested he accompany her there. He agreed, and the two walked together. Outside, Kim Si-hyo and Jang Se-am, who were watching them, reacted with indignation. They were incredulous to see them dining together, and Si-hyo asked what Yoo Jae-han was thinking. Clenching his fists, he thought that Min Yuri had had the audacity to aim her arrow at them in the monster territory, but now she was there, talking with Yoo Jae-han as if nothing had happened. He imagined that this could only be a plan to remove him from the leadership of the guild. Despite that, he concluded that it definitely wasn't the case. Both continued watching through the window of the restaurant where Yoo Jae-han and Min Yuri were seated. Min Yuri, holding a glass of water, commented that the food was delicious. Yoo Jae-han, sitting across from her, agreed. Kim Si-hyo mentally insisted it wasn't that, but she couldn't convince herself. Min Yuri took a sip of coffee and said the aroma was incredible. The protagonist nodded again. Next, the two were seen at a shooting range, where Min Yuri hit a shot. The protagonist, with his hands in his pockets, complimented her performance. Later, they walked down the street, and he asked if she wanted him to carry her teddy bear for her. Min Yuri said it was okay. Meanwhile, as asked Kim Si-hyo if she could see anything suspicious. Kim Si-hyo firmly believed they were on a date. She raised her fist and struck Jang Se-am, who fell to the ground crying in pain. Looking at her, he shouted, asking if she wasn't going to do something about it. She just walked away in the opposite direction, adjusting her cap. She asked herself why she should care about who he wanted to date. She knew she shouldn't, but she still felt irritated. Later, Yoo Jae-han stretched his shoulders, loosening his joints, and commented with a smile that the moment was fun. He said it had been a long time since he had gone out and enjoyed himself like that. Min Yuri, holding the teddy bear in her hands, agreed, saying she felt much better thanks to him. The protagonist could no longer contain his curiosity and asked if it wasn't time for her to explain why she had arranged that meeting. She was surprised by the question. He explained that since she asked to meet him, he imagined she had something important to say. Min Yuri looked down and confessed that actually she just wanted company. Soon after, they arrived in front of a building, and Yoo Jae-han, surprised, asked if it was a hospital. She confirmed, saying that her sister was being treated there. As they walked through the corridors, he thought to himself that Min Yuri's sister must be sick. When they entered the room, he said, "I'm sorry." At that moment, his eyes suddenly shone, and he realized his ability had been activated. Min Yuri introduced her younger sister, still very young. A system window appeared before the protagonist. The message indicated, wouldn't help heal open wounds. It was the extract that had the healing properties. He found it interesting how these small plants, even without direct relation to the cause of the wound, were an essential part of the healing process. Minuri looked away and stayed silent, perhaps thinking that her sister was in a similar situation. Maybe the cause of the critical condition was not directly linked to the saber-toothed tigers. In Yu Jaihan's mind, it was obvious that Minuri already knew this, even without him having to say it. Still, she kept going forward, driven by an obsession for revenge against the monsters that had hurt her sister. In silence, she approached the unconscious girl and placed her hand on her head. It was at that moment that Yu Jaihan revealed he had a proposal. Upon hearing that, she turned with a surprised expression. He explained that he wanted to formally hire her. She, surprised, asked if he really intended for her to join the Fun Guild. He confirmed firmly. He said that if she accepted, everyone in the guild would do their best to help find a cure for her sister. He assured her it was not an empty promise, and that they could even include it in the contract if that would make her feel more secure. Minuri put her hands to her chest and looked at him with some embarrassment. Yu Jaihan then activated his analysis ability. A new system window appeared before him with important data: probability of Mino Yan waking up from the coma, chances of Minuri finding a cure, possibility of her sister's recovery if she joined the Fun Guild. The current status indicated unconscious syndrome, mana discoloration progression, 95%. For him, it seemed the ability was reaffirming what it had shown before. Although it couldn't guarantee Mino Yan's recovery, he knew he needed to recruit Minuri by all possible means. She then asked, somewhat shyly, if she could think it over before giving an answer. Yu Jaihan extended his hand with a light smile and replied that there was no problem. Minuri thanked him, and he concluded that at that moment, the best thing was to let her reflect calmly. Then he left the room and waved to her, saying he didn't want to disturb her any longer and would leave her alone. She nodded, saying it was okay, and apologized for having dragged him there. The protagonist looked at his own hand, took off his bracelet, and said he needed to give her something. She approached and asked what it was about. He then placed the bracelet in her hands and explained it was made of lucky whiskers, an item known to bring good luck. He also commented that he thought it would suit her sister better than him. She smiled, accepted the gift gently, and thanked him, saying she was sure Soyan would like the bracelet. The protagonist turned to leave and informed her he was going now, hoping for a quick answer. She smiled shyly and just replied with an oak bye. Sometime later, at the Ministry of Heroes, the head of the Cause Guild parked and Jun crossed his arms, saying they were already late. A ministry employee walked to the podium, took the microphone, and announced that they had waited enough. Even with the absence of one of the guilds, the meeting had to start. Doha entered the room scratching his head and with ironic seriousness asked who was responsible for calling a meeting at such an absurd time. To him, it seemed like there wasn't even anyone important there. Park Jungzap reprimanded him, reminding him that he had said many times they needed to hurry. Doha put his hands in his pockets and commented that he was already involved in trouble elsewhere, so he didn't see the point in being there, especially with the leader of the Warriors Guild. Kang Junil, with his arms crossed, indignantly retorted that for someone late, he was talking too much. He said it was obvious that everyone was just waiting for him, calling him a lazy idiot. Doha looked at him, smiled, and mocked, saying it seemed like someone had come back from the dead. He mentioned hearing that his guild had been destroyed by a first-class guild. Kang Junil stood up angrily, clenched his fists, and shouted that it would take much more than that to defeat them. He declared that they had eliminated that guild a long time ago. Doha just laughed in response. The master of the Red Hall Guild, Bak Gang Qian, sighed deeply and asked if it was really necessary to make so much noise. He rested his face on his hand and commented that even being a guild leader, Kang Junil was still immature. He said he thought Kang Junil would have learned his lesson after being beaten up, but realized that it had no effect at all. Kang Junil frowned and confronted him, asking if Bak Gang Qian had any complaints to Idea. He only knew mana crystals as energy sources that elementals tend to absorb. He suspected that the recent increase in unknown species might be linked to experiments with liquid mana crystals. With a manic smile, he said he had no doubt about who was behind those grotesque experiments. Gang Qian commented that all of this was interesting, but there was still one unanswered question. He wanted to know what the connection was between all of this and the IUPC. He reminded everyone that at the start of the meeting, there had been mention of evidence linking the IUPC to the case. One of the workers intervened and reported that on the day of the saber-toothed tiger incident, suspicious individuals were seen at the guild facilities. They had been captured by a surveillance drone. The person shown in the images was identified by facial recognition software. His name was Lim Min Su. He was 33 years old, and the department was sure he was a manager of the IUPC. He had previously worked as a researcher in the Department of Magical Engineering, but had been dismissed 4 years ago. Gang Qian asked for more information, inquiring about which incident it was about. The official replied that records indicated he had stolen a mana crystal from the research center. He also stated that Lim had conducted illegal human experiments. Based on the evidence, the Hero Association considered him the prime suspect in the case. To apprehend him as soon as possible, they were requesting everyone's cooperation in the investigation. Later, Yu Jaihan was standing at a bus stop. A nearby young man pointed his cell phone at him and commented to a friend that the guy was worth paying attention to. The other asked what was strange about the clothes he wore and if he happened to think he was a hero. They laughed together, mocking the idea that a hero would be waiting for the bus at that hour. Meanwhile, the protagonist was typing messages to Sai-Hu. He wanted to know if she was coming to the office that day because he had something important to tell her. He noticed that Sai-Hu still hadn't woken up and wondered why she hadn't responded. He told himself he needed to talk to her today. Even without Min-Yuri's reply, he thought it better to soon discuss the possibility of hiring her. He thought that with her experience, she would be an excellent addition to the guild, even without considering his special ability. He sighed, recognizing that the only problem was the lack of funds. Bringing someone like Min-Yuri would be expensive. Still, he recalled they had some money saved. Jang Seum had made a good profit selling monster scrap. If they negotiated well, maybe they could pay enough to hire her. At that moment, a taxi stopped beside him. The driver asked if he wasn't going to get in. He ran to the car hurriedly and answered yes, of course. He told himself he needed to go to the office. After getting in the car, he turned to the driver and asked to be dropped off at the corner of 5th Street. The taxi driver confirmed and then, looking at him through the rearview mirror, asked if he was one of the heroes. It was obvious from the clothes he wore. Yu Jia-han confirmed the driver was right with a slight smile. The man behind the wheel laughed, excited by the situation, thinking he never imagined giving a ride to a hero. He thought he would definitely tell this story to his taxi colleagues during lunch. Yu Jia-han found the gesture kind and thanked him with good humor. The driver then looked at the young man more closely and guessed he must be from one of the big guilds, given his posture and firm gaze. He mentioned well-known names like the Red Hall, the Warriors, the Dice, and even the Face Guild, all recently prominent. Yu Jia-han simply denied and explained that he was part of a new guild called Fun, probably unknown to most. To his surprise, the driver recognized the name and associated the guild with a recent saber-toothed tiger case at the Green Cape Apartments. Yu Jia-han was astonished and wanted to know how he knew about that. The driver replied with a smile, saying he lived in that area. The coincidence surprised Yu Jia-han even more, and he expressed his gratitude. The driver glanced outside the car, lamenting having witnessed that so early in the morning. Yu Jia-han followed his gaze and realized they were talking about the young hybrid girl on the street. The driver confessed that hybrids made him uncomfortable. Yu Jia-han wanted to know why and heard that because of the animal nature of those beings, there were rumors they could lose control. The hero noted that she looked just like a normal high school girl wearing a school uniform. He guessed she was a transformed hybrid. The driver, however, insisted that it didn't matter her appearance or age. According to him, hybrids were not like humans, and while heroes might be able to deal with that, ordinary people like him wouldn't stand a chance against an attack. Yu Jia-han remained silent, reflecting. He knew that after so many invasions and tragedies, it was natural for ordinary people to carry such prejudice. But still, she was just a child. He thought about how many times she must have been judged for being a half-elf. And then something caught his attention. Two suspicious figures appeared behind the girl, entering an alley. He immediately suspected their intentions. He warned the driver that he was going to get off right there. The driver protested, reminding him that they were still far from the destination. But Yu Jia-han had already jumped out of the car, leaving the driver indignant for not having been paid the fare. The hybrid, for her part, sensed she was being followed and took off running. The pursuers noticed and hurried after her, complaining that she had noticed their approach. One of them managed to grab her and pressed a cloth with a sedative substance against her face, preventing her from screaming. With satisfaction, he commented that she was a young hybrid, the kind of prey that was very valuable. The other agreed, saying they had hit the jackpot and that their most important clients would be happy. It was at that moment that Yu Jia-han arrived. He appeared beside them, interrupting the scene, and asked what they were doing. Faced with the threat, the two men hesitated. Yu Jia-han warned that he would count to 3, and if they didn't release her, they would die. With his hand already on the hilt of his sword, he began counting without waiting for a response. He ran forward, determined. He thought 3 seconds was way too long. However, before he could attack, a huge man appeared in front of him, blocking the way. With an intimidating look, he made it clear that this was none of Yu Jia-han's business. He said that he shouldn't get involved even if he was a hero. Yu Jia-han stopped for a moment and, surprised, mentally questioned who that man was. Sometime later, at the headquarters of the Fun Guild, Sia stood beside the table, staring intently at the phone that kept ringing. Sitting on the sofa, Yu Jia-han watched her and asked why she hadn't responded to his messages yet. Irritated, she shouted that it wasn't him who was sending messages. It was just spam. Still, she picked up the phone and asked, almost reluctantly, why he was trying to contact her. Yu Jia-han smiled and said he guessed she was still upset about what had happened the day with Mana. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to block his blade. He concluded he was indeed dealing with another hero. Meanwhile, the rest of the criminal group was loading boxes of medicine into a vehicle, hurrying to leave. They shouted that they had to move quickly and get everything into the car before someone interrupted them. Yu Jia-han noticed the movement and, gritting his teeth, concluded that if he didn't act fast, they would escape. Sai-013 prepared another attack, yelling at his opponent not to turn his back. He struck the ground again but missed because Yu Jia-han had jumped to the side. The hero thought about limiting the damage, considering they were in a residential area, but knew he couldn't hesitate any longer. He had to defeat him once and for all. Not far away, Say-015 watched the scene calmly. He decided to intervene, saying the fight had gone too far. He couldn't allow them to destroy the entire neighborhood. Yu Jia-han noticed the interference and stayed alert. Sai-015 smiled, relieved that they were in a hurry. He said that normally they killed all witnesses, but there was no time to deal with him that day. Yu Jia-han studied him carefully, noticing that this man was also capable of manipulating mana. They were all involved somehow. Sai-015 called a colleague, reminding him the mission was supposed to be completed quietly. He complained that even though it was the partner's first job, he had already caused too much trouble. Maybe the boss wanted to talk to him personally afterward. Sai-013 grumbled that there was nothing left to say and decided to retreat. He punched the wall as a warning and said goodbye in a threatening tone. Yu Jia-han tried to avoid the debris and watched the two with his eyes. Seconds later, the two criminals disappeared. He sheathed his weapon, frustrated, realizing they had escaped. Something didn't seem right about them, and it bothered him. Even so, he couldn't waste time. He needed to find them. He leaped across the rooftops, floating in the air as he used his analysis ability. He wanted to predict where the truck was headed. As he advanced, the area ahead divided into squares, each with a percentage indicating the chance of successfully finding them there. He continued following the trail, convinced he would catch up soon. At that moment, his phone rang. He answered quickly and asked Sai-hu if she was already on her way to the place he had indicated. She replied yes, that she was already in a taxi, but asked, confused about the kidnapping. She hadn't understood well. Yu Jia-han confirmed firmly. He said he had seen the moment when they kidnapped a young hybrid. Worried, she repeated the question, fearing she had heard wrong. He explained he was following the kidnappers and needed her to call the police immediately. He promised he would get back in touch as soon as he had news. Sai-hu ended the call with a heavy heart. She stared at the phone silently. She frowned, reflecting on what he had just said. Another kidnapping involving someone of another species. She recalled that a wave of hate crimes between species had been spreading for some time, and wondered, anguished, why it still hadn't stopped. The protagonist found himself in front of an abandoned house with broken windows and walls covered in soot. He approached silently, feeling a growing tension in his chest. His eyes caught something familiar, a truck parked in the corner of the lot, partially hidden by bushes. He was sure it was the same vehicle he had seen before. Inside, a man was curled up asleep in the driver's seat, his face partially hidden by an ordinary mask. Yu Jia-han approached and knocked on the window with his knuckles, waiting for a reaction. The man woke up with a start. His eyes blinked several times before focusing on the visitor outside. In an instant, fear took over him. He began trembling visibly while clutching his phone with both hands. Frightened, he screamed in panic, asking how that guy had managed to find them. Yu Jia-han, wasting no time, broke the window with a sharp strike and snatched the phone from his hands. With a dry, ironic tone, he commented that maybe the other hadn't heard him knocking, and that you shouldn't keep him waiting. He ordered him to get out of the car immediately. The masked man hesitated, trembling, asking him to wait, saying he wasn't a hero and that he could explain everything. But Yu Jia-han didn't want to listen anymore. He ripped the door off brutally and started pulling him out of the vehicle, ignoring the panicked screams. The blade of his sword gleamed under the dull moonlight as he positioned it against the kidnapper's neck. With controlled coldness, Yu Jia-han informed him that, as a hero, he had the right to arrest any criminal caught in the act, and if necessary, decide whether he would live or not. He gave him one last chance to explain himself. The man muttered almost inaudible curses, while on the other side of the property, inside the abandoned building, the real horror was unfolding. The room was damp, dark, smelling of mold mixed with fear. Hostages were tied up in rows, their bodies still and trembling with terror. A burly figure entered carrying a young woman over his shoulder as if she were just another piece of merchandise. When he placed her in front of another man with a more imposing appearance, the latter crossed his arms and looked at the new acquisition with cold eyes. He wanted to know if this was the special product they had captured that day. The carrier nodded, explaining she was a hybrid, a young woman with feline features exactly as the VIP client had requested. The girl was stretched out on the floor, her eyes wide open, her mouth covered by tape that prevented any coherent sound. Suddenly, in a desperate impulse, she managed to let out a muffled scream, demanding to be let go. The boss just watched with interest. He commented that she still had plenty of energy. Even trembling, she gathered strength to shout that she would pay any amount she had in her pockets, begging for freedom. The man laughed at the offer and sarcastically asked how much money she thought she was worth. She hurriedly replied, 2 million, which she had earned working all weekend. It was all she had. The boss's eyes widened, visibly surprised. 2 million was more than he expected from a girl like her. But soon the enthusiasm turned into contempt. He said that as much as that money was the result of effort, sweat, and sacrifice, it was still insignificant. He grabbed her hair brutally and leaned in, smiling cruelly. Compared to the 900 million they would make from her sale, and that amount was pocket change. He added that he had heard they were planning to use her in experiments. He said she shouldn't be so upset. At least she would be treated specially, unlike other hybrids who had been sold. Rixis, though weak, looked at him with tears in her eyes. He then asked with an almost casual cruelty, if that wasn't better than being sent to a war camp. There were body bags scattered around her, and in her mind, the idea arose that someone needed to do something to help her. The room was filled with bodies. The boss stepped away from the hostage and informed those present that only 40 minutes remained before the client's arrival. He said everything needed to be prepared and ordered them to hide those damn bags somewhere far away. The employee agreed without hesitation. Rixus then stood up abruptly and protested, claiming that everyone there knew their actions were illegal, and if discovered, the consequences would be disastrous. However, the boss only smiled sarcastically and asked what they planned to do with the hostages. Rixus believed that people thought she had committed a crime before becoming a hybrid, but that wasn't true. Still, she knew she needed to face reality. After everything her species had done to humans, this would probably be considered just sweet revenge by most. In the eyes of others, she was nothing more than a monster. Anger burned in her eyes as she internally refused to go along with it. Her body began to react, her abilities activated uncontrollably, and she understood she needed to escape even if it drove her into madness. However, suddenly she felt her abilities being blocked. Surprised, she tried to understand what was happening and why her power was failing. The employee approached and coldly explained that she was unable to use her mana. Frightened, she barely had time to react before being brutally thrown to the ground. Her face was pressed against the floor as she questioned what they had done to her. The man responded indifferently that they had injected a mana suppressor, something very effective against hybrids. He added that everyone was aware of her little games and had therefore taken all precautions. The boss then asked the employee to be gentle as the merchandise shouldn't be damaged. While coughing and moaning in pain, the employee commented that if she didn't learn to obey, she would cause even bigger problems in the future. The medicine was applied again and the boss smiled, saying he believed she had received the message. He ordered that she be taken to the hotel and warned that if she tried to cause trouble again, it should knock her out. The employee nodded silently. Suddenly, the boss began to tremble, and those around him did as well. Panic set in as they asked if something was happening above them. Supposedly, there was a special person positioned to deal with this kind of emergency. That was when the protagonist appeared beside them. With a single blow, he made the surrounding stones explode, causing a deafening crash. Entering the room, he raised a cloud of dust. The boss, frightened, shouted to know who that man was. The newcomer, identified as Yujai Han, declared that everyone was under arrest for illegal trafficking of foreigners and kidnapping, according to the Human Protection Act. One employee, desperate, pointed out that he was a hero, the same one who had prevented the kidnapping of a hybrid earlier. The boss, irritated, questioned why he hadn't been informed, to which the other replied that he had believed his team had handled the problem. Yujai Han silently observed the group. His eyes analyzed the hostages as he tried to understand the meaning of the situation. To him, the men present were clearly the main culprits. Among the hostages, he recognized the same girl from before along with several corpses. The reality was even more serious than he had imagined. Although he intended to leave the case to the police, he decided he couldn't ignore it. From now on, those individuals were monsters who needed to be eliminated. Without hesitation, he drew his weapon and prepared for confrontation. The boss, terrified, knelt and begged for mercy, saying he was just following orders. Yujai Han's right hand gripped his throat, and the protagonist demanded to know who the real leader behind this was. The boss refused to say the name, claiming it was better to be defeated there than to reveal such information. In his mind, it seemed absurd to think someone like Yujai Han actually expected an answer. After all, his men were ready to kill him. The fighters attacked from behind the protagonist, but he noticed the assault and activated his analysis skill. The stones scattered across the room began to collapse and float, creating a curtain of dust and confusion. That's how the opponents lost sight of him and started wondering where he had disappeared to. Above, Yujai Han appeared floating and stated he had already moved. The enemies turned their attention to him, staying alert. Yujai Han thought they were all hiding their presence to surprise him, which made clear they were not amateurs. Maybe they were heroes too. He spun his weapon and hit two of them at once. The others tried to stop his advance, but Yujai Han reacted quickly and aimed at another fighter. He realized that one was extremely fast. Over time, he managed to defeat all the combatants, leaving only the boss. The boss, in shock, began to tremble and murmured that this was impossible. He thought his men were among the strongest, even comparable to level 5 heroes. The protagonist then advanced on him and warned him not to try to escape. After some time, there were several injured scattered across the room. The employee and the boss lay on the floor, moaning in pain. Yujai Han freed the hostages, and as he did, one of the prisoners asked who he was. He replied that he was there to help them and said she was now free. While untying her hands, he said the police should already be on their way and asked her to tell what had happened that day. She nodded but said she would only share important information. She looked around and asked about the others. Yujai Han, with a sorrowful expression, replied that he was sorry, but no one else had survived. She remained silent, trembling, until she began to cry. She questioned why they were being treated that way since none of them had asked to be born. She said she didn't understand why everyone considered them monsters, and that it was deeply unfair. Yujai Han watched her with sadness, wanting to say something to comfort her, but no words came out. Deep down, he knew nothing he said would change that reality. At that moment, the members of the Fun Guild and the police approached the building, shouting that the guild's hero had captured the kidnappers. The police confirmed the information and ordered all units to act cautiously. Custodio stood in front of the building showing great concern. Meanwhile, in a small cozy building, Min-Soo Lim was sitting at a table next to a companion. He said he really appreciated the time the other had taken to be there. The other smiled and replied that actually he was the one thanking him for the invitation. Min-Soo raised his small cup and smiling commented that the sample provided had been very useful. He said he had almost mastered the ability to control mana crystals with 100% precision. The companion confirmed, saying he had also heard about him on the news. It seemed they were drawing quite a bit of attention and the association was already watching their actions. Despite this, they still managed to operate without major difficulties. At that moment, he poured a drink into a small glass for the acquaintance. Min-Soo Lim laughed and said that of course there was nothing to worry about. He commented that if he were to be honest, he didn't want any more trouble as there were already enough bad news that day. He raised the cup before his face and asked what he meant by that. His interlocutor asked if no one had told him anything. He explained that it seemed a minor plague was spreading through one of the factories and that the police were now investigating the entire area. The factory contained many valuable materials that could be used. Because of this, the supply had been interrupted. He said he didn't know if it was a coincidence, but the saboteur who had discovered the warehouse was the same one who had defeated the mutant saber-toothed cat. He believed this needed to be dealt with quickly and discreetly. Meanwhile, in the building where the hostages were, the protagonist took ruse outside. Min-Soo Lim took a sip of his drink and commented that he couldn't believe something of that magnitude could happen. However, he said it wasn't something she should personally worry about. After drinking, purple waves began to form on his face. Hey everyone, did you enjoy this story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.